Alright, so here we are, lecture 11B. This is the second half of the first half of glycolysis. Man, oh man, I'm confusing myself. So let's just take a moment here and talk about the chunks of these lectures. Glycolysis is split up into two entire lectures. Lecture 11 and 12 together tell the full story of glycolysis. Lecture 11 split up into two chunks, A and B. So A, we kind of introduced glycolysis as a process and gave you different reaction types, gave you the roadmap. Now, in the second chunk, lecture B, we're going to talk about the first half of glycolysis, the first 5 reactions. Lecture 12, A and B, will be about the rest of glycolysis. So we're really spreading glycolysis out here across 4 or 5 different chunks spread across lecture 11 and 12. I just want that to be clear. So this is lecture 11B, and we will finish up the first stage of glycolysis by the end of this lecture chunk. So we already talked about the general types of reactions in glycolysis, redox reactions, dehydrations, isomerizations, phosphorylations, etc. And we introduced the roadmap in general. I hope that you came away from that first chunk just having a pretty good understanding of glycolysis as a general process. Again, we'll spend the rest of the time here in this chunk talking about stage 1 of glycolysis in detail. So this is where we ended off the last lecture. I just want to come back to here to make sure that we overlap our concepts. This is our roadmap, and we already said that our first step is going to be to phosphorylate glucose into glucose 6-phosphate, and there we burn an ATP. So let's talk about that a little bit more in depth. And we will take each of the steps of glycolysis one at a time in this way, talking about each in detail so it makes sense. So the phosphorylation of glucose to glucose 6-phosphate is not a favorable reaction. That reaction has a delta G of positive 13.8 kilojoules per mole, so the universe does not want this to happen. Remember, our main strategy for driving unfavorable reactions forward is to couple those reactions to favorable reactions. So it's easy to see here, I think, that the reaction we've coupled here is the hydrolysis of ATP. The hydrolysis of ATP has a delta G of negative 30.5 kilojoules per mole. That's a very negative and favorable reaction. It gives off a lot of energy. And what is coupling these two reactions is the phosphate group itself. ATP is hydrolyzed to ADP and inorganic phosphate. That's our favorable reaction. And it is that inorganic phosphate released by that hydrolysis that glucose accepts to become glucose 6-phosphate, the unfavorable reaction. Remember, as soon as two reactions are coupled together, the delta G of all of those reactions in total equals the sum of all of the individual delta Gs of those reactions. And so if we take negative 30.5 and we add to it 13.8, we get negative 16.7. Overall, a favorable reaction. The universe allows us to phosphorylate glucose because in order to do that, we had to burn ATP, and this net energy release is the universe profit. It's the bribe of the universe. So there's an irony in this story, however. The point of glucose metabolism is to make ATP. That's why we're doing everything we're about to be doing for the next 6 lectures. Glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, the electron transport chain, oxidative phosphorylation, all of it is only so that the cell can make ATP. Yet, here we are in step 1, burning ATP. What's going on? So, like, in the end, that means we're using ATP to make ATP? Let's just say forget it all and stick with what we've got, right? Why use something up just to make it again? Well, kind of we're using ATP to make ATP, but by burning some ATP now, we make more ATP later. Let me give you this analogy. When my first daughter was first born, I was absolutely floored at how expensive daycare was. Floored. Couldn't believe it. Baby care, child care, oh my God. It was just incredible. So I said, you know what, I'm going to quit my job. I told my wife, you work, I'll stay home, I'll be Mr. Mom, I'd be happy to be Mr. Mom, and we don't have to pay daycare. And as we looked at the cost of daycare, and we looked at the salary that I was making, we realized that as expensive as daycare was for our baby, I actually made more going to work, even having to pay daycare, than we would save had I stayed home. I'll say it a different way. The cost of daycare per month was less than my salary per month. So it was better for the family for me to go to work. What that really meant was that I would make more money for the family by taking some of my salary and using it for daycare and at least reaping some kind of benefit. The cell is in the same exact predicament. Yes, these early stages of glycolysis cost the cell money, energy, in the form of ATP, just like daycare cost my family money. But by spending that money up front now, the cell stands to make a profit of energy later on, just as me paying for daycare today let me go to work to make money that I would collect at the end of the month. In life, oftentimes, you've got to spend money to make money. Spending some up front now makes you more in the long term. And for the cell, it's the same exact thing. The cell needs to spend energy now in these early stages of glycolysis if it wants to make even more energy later as glucose metabolism finishes up. So this is an investment of energy, not a cost. The enzyme responsible for step 1 of glycolysis is called HexaKinase. Oh, I love that name. Hexo, for what? For 6. Remember, our 6 carbon sugars are called hexoses. So this hexo means that the enzyme works on 6 carbon sugars, including glucose. What does this enzyme do to those 6 carbon sugars? Well, that's in the rest of the name, kinase. It phosphorylates them because that's what kinases do. So this enzyme tells you that it is an enzyme that phosphorylates 6 carbon sugars. It's all in the name. Here's the reaction. Here's glucose in its cyclized form. HexaKinase gets to work with a little bit of energy and the phosphate from ATP. ADP is yielded through the hydrolysis of ATP, and there is ATP's phosphate, now living on carbon 6, giving us glucose 6-phosphate. HexaKinase exhibits the property that we've discussed before called relative substrate specificity. The reason why this enzyme is not called glucokinase, but is called hexokinase, is because this enzyme can act on more than just glucose. This enzyme has an affinity for many different 6-carbon sugars, of which glucose is one, so it has relative substrate specificity. It's pretty promiscuous. It'll phosphorylate glucose, but it'll phosphorylate other 6-carbon sugars as well. So relative substrate specificity, because it doesn't have just one substrate, it can choose from a limited number of different substrates. Glucose 6-phosphate, which again is the product of this first reaction, directly inhibits hexakinase. So we call this feedback inhibition. Notice all of the old concepts from the beginning of the lectures that are coming back now. Feedback inhibition is also referred to as negative feedback. This is where the product of a reaction inhibits that reaction itself. And so we see here that step 1 of glycolysis is a control point for glycolysis. It allows us to regulate glycolysis. There will only be a handful of such control points through this process. There's only a few limited number of times that we can actually turn glycolysis on or off, but step 1 is one of those points. By having too much glucose 6-phosphate around, that glucose 6-phosphate itself can inhibit hexakinase, and that will shut glycolysis down by shutting down the cell's ability to perform step 1. So here's our roadmap, a little bit more of a detailed view, and we just did this. We just phosphorylated glucose to glucose 6-phosphate. And we didn't linearize it. That's just for the ease of seeing this. So glucose is still a cyclized sugar. And there's the phosphate on carbon 6. Step 2. Step 2 is an isomerization reaction. We're not going to lose anything. We're not going to gain anything. We're just going to move stuff around. And in this reaction, we are isomerizing glucose 6-phosphate. Notice the product of step 1 is the reactant of step 2, right? Because it's a pathway. So glucose 6-phosphate is going to be isomerized into fructose 6-phosphate. I always liken isomerization reactions to alternate side of the street parking. For those of you who live in cities, cities will often do this so that the streets can be cleaned. So every Tuesday, sometimes, let's say for argument's sake, or in this example, Monday, for every Monday, you can't park on this side of the street because the street cleaner is going to come and sweep that curb. And then every Tuesday, you can't park on the other side of the street because the street cleaner is going to come and sweep that curb. So all the time, every week, all the cars are moving from one side to another. Same cars are parked in that street every day, right? Cars don't leave, cars don't come in, but they're just moving all the time, and that's an isomerization reaction. No new groups coming in, no new groups going, they're just moving from one side of the molecule to another. So here's the reaction schematic itself. A glucose 6-phosphate rearranged into fructose 6-phosphate, not much more to say about it than that. If you want to, be my guest, pause the lecture and count up all the individual atoms in these two schematics, and you will find that the same number of oxygens, hydrogens, carbons, and phosphate exist in both of these molecules. Nothing gained and nothing taken away. As a result of this isomerization, C1 is reduced and C2 is oxidized. We move some oxygens and hydroxyls around, but we're still not gaining anything. Everything is happening within the molecule itself. And the phosphate stays put. We can see that in the names. Glucose 6-phosphate, fructose 6-phosphate. The phosphate remains on the 6th carbon. Now, I've kind of alluded to it in step 1, but now I'll make it explicit here. The enzyme name for step 2 is glucose phosphate isomerase. Oh, it almost gives me goosebumps. Because if you think about it, what would be a wonderful name for an enzyme that isomerizes phosphorylated glucose? I don't know. Let me tap my chin. An enzyme that isomerizes phosphorylated glucose. Perhaps we should name it glucose phosphate isomerase. So if you think about it, these enzyme names tell you exactly what the reaction is doing. And that's why I'm asking you to memorize them. By remembering the 10 enzyme names of the 10 steps of glycolysis, you will remember the entire pathway, because the enzyme names tell you exactly what they're doing. So here is step 2 in the schematic. Glucose 6-phosphate isomerized into fructose 6-phosphate. Step 3. Fructose 6-phosphate is then phosphorylated to become fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. And I'm sure you can tell me where that new phosphate group that we just added lives. It lives on carbon 1. Fructose 6-phosphate had a phosphate group on carbon 6 already. When we phosphorylate that molecule again, that new phosphate goes to carbon 1, giving us fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. Here's that reaction schematic. Here is fructose 6-phosphate. ATP is driving this reaction forward yet again, both from an energetics perspective through coupling of the reaction as well as being the donator for the phosphate group. ATP becomes ADP. The energy released by that hydrolysis is the energy allowing this reaction to move forward. And that phosphate that's released to go from adenosine triphosphate to adenosine diphosphate is the phosphate that we pop on carbon 1 here. Fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. Anybody want to guess why this is fructose 1,6-bisphosphate and not fructose 1,6-diphosphate? It's adenosine diphosphate. Why are we saying bis all of a sudden? There are 2 phosphates on this molecule. Why don't we just call it diphosphate? Anybody want to take a guess? If you've realized that those 2 phosphates are on 2 different carbons, that's the reason why this is called a bisphosphate molecule. Diphosphate means the 2 phosphates are linked together, 1, 2, as in adenosine diphosphate. In adenosine diphosphate, the 2 phosphates are linked as pyrophosphate. Here, because the phosphates are on 2 different groups, they're linked to 2 different carbons, we don't say di, we say bisphosphate. So glucose or fructose bisphosphate is telling you that the 2 phosphates are in 2 different locations. And fructose 1,6-bisphosphate tells you that those 2 locations are carbon 1 and carbon 6. Here's a diphosphate. This is adenosine diphosphate, and you can see the 2 phosphates are linked to one another. Of course, this reaction in and of itself is not favorable. It has a positive delta G, just like step 1, but just as in step 1, the reaction is occurring because it's coupled to ATP hydrolysis. That phosphate is responsible for the coupling, and more energy is released from hydrolyzing that ATP than energy needed to drive step 3 forward, and so the same logic applies. And I told you we would burn 2 ATP molecules in all of glycolysis, and of course we just burned that second ATP. From here on in glycolysis, we will only be making ATP. Now step 3 is more important above and beyond it just being a second phosphorylation event. Step 3 is the committed step of glycolysis. It is the point of no return. Once this reaction has occurred, glycolysis must go to completion. The sugar molecule we are metabolizing must be made into pyruvate. There's no way to back up. The reason for this is because glucose 6-phosphate can be used for lots of other things. Fructose 6-phosphate can also be used for lots of other things that the cell might need. But fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, a pretty useless molecule. In fact, the only thing that fructose 1,6-bisphosphate can do is enter step 4 of glycolysis. So if you've completed step 3 of glycolysis and you decide as the cell, you know what, I'm sorry I did this. I don't want to do this anymore. What else can I use this fructose 1,6-bisphosphate for? Because turns out I don't really need it here. The answer is you can't use it anywhere else. So it's either waste it or turn it into pyruvate. And so once step 3 is completed, you have to see glycolysis through. So step 3 is irreversible, cannot go backwards, and it is catalyzed by an enzyme that we will affectionately refer to as PFK, phosphofructokinase. What another beautiful name. It's an enzyme that phosphorylates fructose, which is already phosphorylated. That's what that enzyme name means. If an enzyme calls itself phosphofructokinase, it is telling you, I am a kinase that phosphorylates phosphofructose. And indeed, that's exactly what we saw this enzyme do. It added a phosphate group to fructose 6-phosphate. Step 3 is another control point for glycolysis. By controlling PFK, we can control the rate of glycolysis. If we turn PFK's activity up, glycolysis goes faster. And if we turn PFK's activity down, glycolysis will slow down and go slower. We can actually look a little bit closer at the kinetics of phosphofructokinase, and we see that a graph representing its activity is sigmoidal. We've seen sigmoidal activity graphs for enzymes before, and that tells us that PFK is an allosteric enzyme. PFK is exhibiting positive cooperativity. The reaction is getting easier as it moves forward. All allosteric enzymes have allosteric effectors, and the allosteric effector for PFK is ATP. It's a negative effector, meaning high levels of ATP slow PFK down. Low levels of ATP activate PFK and speed it up. Let's ask ourselves, does that make sense? If we think about it, when ATP levels are high, why in the world do you need glycolysis? Glycolysis is metabolizing glucose to turn it into pyruvate, so that you can make acetyl-CoA for the citric acid cycle, so that eventually oxidative phosphorylation can be done to make ATP. Everything we're doing is to make ATP. So if ATP levels are high already, we don't need to do any of this. So ATP slows phosphofructokinase down, because if ATP is around, you don't need glycolysis. But likewise, if ATP levels are low, then the cell has a bit of a cellular emergency. It needs more ATP and it needs it right away. If you need more ATP, you better be doing glycolysis pretty fast so that you can do the citric acid cycle, so that you can do oxidative phosphorylation, so you can make more ATP in a hurry. So low levels of ATP are a trigger point, speeding PFK up so that glycolysis can move faster. So when ATP levels are high, the cell realizes that it has energy on hand, it doesn't need more. So why spend time and effort doing glycolysis to make more of what you already have? It's a pretty ingenious system if you think about it. It makes a lot of intuitive sense, and if you understand it that way, you can reason your way through the regulation of these processes by just thinking like a cell. In fact, many times on the exams, I will have questions like, does this make sense from the perspective of the cell? And here's an example where it makes perfect sense from the perspective of the cell. Why make more ATP if you've already got some on hand? So that was a lot about step 3, the committed step of glycolysis, where we take fructose 6-phosphate and phosphorylate it once again with fructose to become fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. ATP is the donor for that phosphate group, providing the energy to move this reaction forward, and the enzyme is phosphofructokinase, or PFK. Step 4. Step 4 is a cleavage reaction, and we will now split fructose 1,6-bisphosphate into 2 equal 3 carbon molecules. We're going to take 6 carbon fructose 1,6-bisphosphate and cleave it into 2 3 carbon molecules. Here you see fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, and it's cleaved into 2 molecules that contain 1, 2, 3 carbons each. And these numbers on these carbons indicate their previous numbers when they were part of fructose. We can see literally fructose was cut in half, with the first 3 carbons in our first product molecule and the second 3 carbons in the second. These 2 carbon molecules are different. One is called dihydroxyacetone phosphate, or DHAP, D-H-A-P, we'll call that DHAP. And the other is glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, which is sometimes represented in the book or in the lecture as G3P for glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. But that's hard to say, G3P, so we usually refer to this molecule as GAP, just to make it easier to roll off the tongue. So fructose 1,6-phosphate is cleaved into DHAP and GAP. And if you think about it, we did it, right? I've been telling you all along we wanted to take glucose, 6-carbon sugar, and convert it into 2 3-carbon sugars. And we just did that. We're done. But no, don't get ahead of yourself. We're not done yet. We have a long way to go. We said that we need to turn glucose, a 6-carbon molecule, into 2 molecules of pyruvate, which has 3 carbons each, and we are a long way from pyruvate. The enzyme responsible for this reaction is aldolase. It's probably the only, well, not probably, it's the only enzyme in all of glycolysis where truly the name needs to be memorized. Aldolase really doesn't tell you intuitively much about what this enzyme does. So there we are, step 4, the cleavage of fructose 1,6-bisphosphate into GAP and DHAP by aldolase. But look what we see here. If we look at the later stages of glycolysis, we notice that they happen to run in parallel. It looks like the exact same thing is happening in each of these parallel arms of glycolysis. And we can see here on the left, there's GAP, we just made GAP. And lots of things happen to GAP on the way to pyruvate. But in the second arm, we know that the other molecule we just made is DHAP. So how can DHAP go down the same reaction pathway as GAP? Well, we have to somehow convert DHAP into GAP. We want to end with 2 identical GAP molecules, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphates, so that we can process those 2 GAPs in an identical fashion on their way to pyruvate. The only way to end up now with 2 GAPs is to somehow convert DHAP into GAP. And that's step 5. So step 5 is the isomerization of DHAP to GAP, because only GAP can continue on with the later steps of glycolysis. Our cells do not contain enzymes that can metabolize DHAP, and so that means either half of every glucose molecule needs to be wasted, because we can't do squat with DHAP in the first place. But my God, what a waste would that be, right? If half of every sugar we consumed had to be thrown away, that sounds ridiculous. That sound like life to you? Have you encountered many examples of waste when it comes to living cells? Of course not. So DHAP is not going to be wasted. The cell would never do that. Instead, the cell is going to isomerize DHAP into GAP. And the enzyme responsible for that isomerization is called triose phosphate isomerase. Oh, there they are again, goosebumps. Oh, man, talk about an awesome name. Triose phosphate isomerase. You can ask this enzyme, my God, triose phosphate isomerase, what do you do? And this enzyme would give you a very strange look, because it would answer, why, I isomerize phosphorylated trioses. Couldn't you see that from my name? What is DHAP? It's a 3-carbon sugar. What do we call 3-carbon sugars? Triose. Remember, DHAP came from half of fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. So DHAP, in fact, the P of DHAP, stands for the phosphate group that it is carrying. So DHAP is indeed a phosphorylated triose, and that phosphorylated triose is going to be isomerized by triose phosphate isomerase. Tells you what it does. So DHAP is isomerized into GAP by triose phosphate isomerase, and now we have 2 molecules of GAP poised together to enter stage 2 of glycolysis, the last 5 steps of glycolysis. At this point, we have converted 6-carbon glucose into 2 molecules of the 3-carbon sugar glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. We are slowly getting to the end product of pyruvate that we are after. So in the next lecture, lecture 12, we will pick up right from where we leave off here and begin talking about step 6 of glycolysis, in which we will act upon those 2 molecules of GAP in parallel and eventually get them on their way to becoming pyruvate. Back to step 5, though, from an energetics perspective, the delta G for this isomerization reaction is slightly unfavorable. It requires a little bit of energy. It's a positive 2.41 kilojoules per mole. Now, that's not a killer delta G, but it is positive. It would be easy and understandable for you to think of this as an unfavorable reaction. Indeed, it has a positive delta G. But just as coupling allows one reaction to drive another forward, series of reactions are coupled to one another when they are tied together as single pathways. I like to think of this as a type of super coupling. As we go down the road of glycolysis, we're going to see that glycolysis overall as an entire pathway is very favorable. It has a very high negative delta G. The universe makes a lot of energy release. The universe gets a whole lot more chaotic by glycolysis occurring than it would compared to glycolysis not occurring at all. So as far as the universe is concerned, the universe loves glycolysis. The universe really likes it when glycolysis occurs because heat is released as a result. So a few, as long as they're small, a few small, slightly positive delta G's scattered about here and there on a few of the steps of glycolysis are not going to be enough to turn the tide for the universe and make glycolysis not occur. Because the net gain of energy release at the end of glycolysis is so enticing, these few very moderate, very modest positive delta G's do not stop glycolysis from occurring. Too much free energy as heat stands to be released as this process. Too much entropy stands to be gained. So while we're talking about energetics, let's end with this. This is table 17.1 from your textbook, another excellent study resource. In fact, if you take this table and couple it with that roadmap figure that we discussed, you've got yourself amazing study resources for the exam. And of course, it's all here in the lecture, so you can just screenshot it from here as well if you don't have the textbook. As you can see, this table gives you the step numbers all the way on the left, all 10 steps of glycolysis. We have the reactions themselves in the next column. For example, step 1 is glucose and ATP becomes glucose 6-phosphate and ADP. Then you've got the enzyme names, which we've been talking about all along. And here we see the energetics of those reactions, the delta G's. So we can see the reactions that give off energy and the reactions that don't. Incidentally, this is a table giving you the values for delta G0 prime. Remember that. That is the biochemical redefinition of the standard state conditions of chemistry. So we know that these reactions were conducted at 1 atmosphere of pressure with elemental purity with a pH of 7. So let's talk about what we've seen so far. We've completed stage 1 of glycolysis, the first half of glycolysis. We began with glucose, and that glucose was phosphorylated to glucose 6-phosphate by the enzyme HexaKinase. Glucose 6-phosphate was then isomerized to become fructose 6-phosphate. Nothing gained, nothing lost, just a rearrangement of the constituent parts. Fructose 6-phosphate was then phosphorylated once again to become fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. The enzyme responsible for that was phosphofructokinase, or PFK. Step 1 required an ATP molecule. Step 3 required an ATP molecule. 2 ATPs had been burned. Fructose 1,6-bisphosphate was then cleaved into GAP and DHAP. And finally, DHAP was isomerized to a second molecule of GAP by triose phosphate isomerase. We now have 2 molecules of GAP lined up and poised, ready to begin stage 2 of glycolysis. We've burned 2 ATPs. At this point, we have not made a single ATP. So halfway through glycolysis, we are at an ATP deficit. But again, we're poised to begin stage 2 of this process and see what happens to GAP as we continue down glycolysis. These 2 parallel pathways, side by side, in parallel, will eventually convert GAP into pyruvate which is the net goal of glycolysis. In addition, along the way, we will begin making ATP, eventually breaking even, and after that, our 2 ATP profit. As I told you in the last lecture chunk, glycolysis makes 4 molecules of ATP, burns 2 for a net gain of 2 molecules. We've seen 2 burned, we haven't seen any made yet, and that's because ATP is made in stage 2. But all of that is for the next lecture, lecture 12, and so until then, thanks so much for watching.